My name is Miriam Borden, and I serve as a member of the Toronto Workmen Circle Board of Directors. Thank you for attending our annual commemoration of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which began 83 years ago today. April 19th, 1943 was the first night of Passover. On that night, German forces entered the Warsaw Ghetto to carry out its final liquidation. They encountered armed resistance. 700 young Jewish fighters participated in what became known as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It was the largest uprising by Jews during World War II and the first significant urban revolt against German occupation in Europe. When the full uprising began on April 19th, the fighters were hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. They knew the battle could not be won. Yet for nearly a month, until May 16th, they held off the full might of the German army. And while the armed battle remains the most visible act of defiance, it was only the final layer of a sophisticated, multi-year strategy of resistance. The Hilf, the Jewish Self-Help Society, organized house committees and soup kitchens, making mutual aid a condition of survival. Orchestras, theaters, and Yiddish puppet shows for children persisted alongside underground schools and libraries that sustained communal life under conditions of extreme deprivation. The Oynig Shabbos archive, led by Emanuel Ringelblum, was perhaps the most radical act of all. This archive of tens of thousands of documents was gathered in secret and preserved so that the victims, not the victors, would write the history. In all of these ways, the ghetto inhabitants demonstrated that resistance is as much about internal preservation as it is about external defiance. For decades, Jewish communities and cultural organizations across the globe have acted as stewards of this memory, ensuring that the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is not reduced to a footnote of military history. For the Arbeiter Ring, it functions as a yortsayt, a collective anniversary of mourning for families, culture, and a world the Nazis intended to erase. They failed, and we honor the past and all those who died fighting for our future. But honoring the past requires more than mourning. It demands a shift from passive remembrance to active responsibility. Reflection alone is not protection. The words "never again" do not make themselves true, and Holocaust education on its own has not prevented the return of anti-Jewish hatred. We are living through that return now. Jewish communities are navigating a landscape marked by trauma, by the proliferation of anti-Semitic tropes across digital spaces and in the streets where we live, and by a growing sense of isolation in institutions that once promised solidarity. I am named for Miriam and Malka, my great-aunt and her young daughter, whose last contact with my grandmother came from within the walls of the Warsaw Ghetto. I speak from the third generation. We study this history to grasp the scale of loss and to honor what continues to reverberate. And since October 7th, in Israel, online, and around the world, we are being reminded that certain things do reverberate, some horrifyingly. The sense of security for Jewish communities has been shattered. We are navigating a landscape scarred and changed by the reactions of supposed allies and a massive spike in global aggression. So the question is not only how we remember, but how we act. Our duty is no less to commemorate the heroism of the Warsaw Ghetto fighters than to learn the lesson of their sacrifice, that the dual model of resistance and resilience is our primary psychological and strategic tool.
Shtiler, Shtiler, lass mir schweigen, Quorim wachsen do. Sorgen sie verpflanzt die Sonne im grünen See zum Blau. Es wären Wegen zu Bonheur zu, es wird kein Weg zurück. Ist der Tate wo verschwunden und mit ihm das Glück. Stiller Kind mein Wein nicht selbst nicht kein Gewinn. Unser Unglück will in Sonne im sei wie nicht verstehen. Land, wo am armes Kind geht Oyfn nach. Wie die Vilje a geschmiedet, euch geh euch in Pein. Ziehen Gräs euch durch Litte, gibt's in Jahr rein. Sfert der Heuschach, wo zerronnen, von der finster Leichen Sonnen. Reiter, komm geschwind, dir ruft dein Kind, dir ruft dein Kind. Shtiler, Shtilers Quellen quallen uns in Hauptsaru. Bis der Teuer wird nicht fallen, sein wir müssen stumm. Freinit Kind sich, sie ist ein Schmechel, jetzt fahr uns verrat. Send dem Frühling soll der Säune wie in Hauptsablatt. Soll der Qual sich ruhig fließen, stiller sei und hoff. Mit der Freiheit kommt der Tate, schlafsche Kind mein Schlaf. Wie die Vilje aber freite, wie die Bäume grün beneite, leicht bald Freiheitslicht auf dein Gesicht, auf dein Gesicht.
Kommes, Haynt is yortsayt. Yortsayt, Haynt, a Zind. Wenn gerufen hat zu dir ein erstgeboren Kind. Haynt is yortsayt noch ein Schmeichel über Wald und Plain. Jeder hat Haynt yortsayt, noch sein Schwell, noch sich allein. Haynt is yortsayt noch Regen 1943, noch ein letzten Karschenbäum und Schwellballe dabei. Haynt is yortsayt noch mein Zeit, verfreuren in Ponar. Haynt is yortsayt noch mein Mames gellen Samovar. Noch ein Schnee von meiner Weißlein ausgeschneit, beschaß ich hab zugedeckt mit dem Käfer von mein Gas. Haynt is yortsayt noch die 2 Malochen bei mein Bett. Haynt is yortsayt noch ein Zoffenstern ergetät. Yortsayt noch ein Spiegel mit einem blauen Teich im Rahmen, wo es bäumten sich die Licht und Schottens von mein Stamm. Haynt is yortsayt noch ein Schabbes, rein wie ein Brillant. Haynt is yortsayt noch der Fiddle in mein Chavers Hand. Haynt is yortsayt noch ein Leib in Friedigen und Bläus. Haynt is yortsayt noch der letzte yortsayt Licht in Kleus. Yortsayt noch einen langen Säger auf der Wand von Lehm. Oi, noch alle Wieglieder von unser Irrwein.
Today is yortsayt. God of vengeance, today is yortsayt. Today we mourn the day you were summoned by your firstborn. Today we mourn a smile which covered dell and wood. Today we mourn ourselves, our home and neighborhood. Today I mourn the rain in 1943, the last little swallow in the nearby cherry tree. Today I mark my time frozen in Pinar. Today I remember my mama's yellow samovar. The snow which the whites of my eyes have shed and which covered my street, now the graves of my dead. Today I mourn the 2 angels by my bed and the North Star somewhere overhead. I mourn the mirror with its lake blue frame, where bathe the light and shadows of my roots, my name. Today I mourn a Sabbath pristine and grand. Today I mourn the fiddle in my comrade's hand. yortsayt for a body joyously in bloom, and for the last votive in the shul's small room. It's yortsayt for the tall clock upon the whitewashed wall, and for every lullaby of generations all.
A summons to remember. On the first Seder night in April 1943, the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto took up arms against their Nazi overlords. It was the beginning of an epic battle, not for victory as the resistance fighters knew from the outset, but for the honor of their people. On the walls of the ghetto, they posted an 11th commandment: "Thou shalt not despair." It was their watchword and their legacy. When the battle was near its end, the few Jews who still survived issued an appeal to their brethren around the world. Remember us. Do not forget what we have suffered at the hands of our murderous enemy. Let our departure from the world in ashes and in smoke not be in vain. The Battle of the Ghetto glows in Jewish history. It is immortalized in scores of writings and sanctified in the annals of the human spirit. It has nourished the will of new generations to renew and fortify their national and cultural heritage. We will forever remember the fighters who fell in the Warsaw Ghetto.
Ayer, heylikn, zikorn. Alle meine Tag seien yortsayt Licht, ayer, heylikn, zikorn. Und alle Nacht mit Stimme, auf eure verschämte Quorum. Durch Berg von Asch und Räuchen schwarze, ich gehe zu euch von Stadt zu Stadt. Und sie ist durchschlagen von mein Herzen, das Wiederkoll von euer letzten Trott. Nur wo soll ich sein Spur jetzt suchen? Auf welche Stichen? Als alle Wegen hab meier Pein getragen und euer Blut hat die ganze Erde gezwungen. Jeden Menschen kommt 7 Tage von Treue. Wie viel Jahren soll mein Treuer dauern, kedei zu sitzen Schive noch Millionen, a Volk a ganz in Wettig zu dermonnen. Seien alle meine Tage die Yortsayt Licht, ayer, heylikn, zikorn, und alle Nacht mit Stimme auf eure verschämte Quorum.
Shtil, die Nacht ist oysgeshternt und der Frost hat stark gebrennt. Sie gedenkst du, wie ich hab dich gelernt, halten a Speyer in die Hand. Sie gedenkst du, wie ich hab dich gelernt, halten a Speyer in die Hand. A Moid, a Pelzel und a Beret und halt in Hand fest an a Gun. A Moid mit a Sameten im Bronim, he topped dem Soines Karawan. A Moid mit a Sameten im Bronim, he topped dem Soines Karawan. Gezielt, geschossen und getroffen, hat ihr kleinen Kerl Pistol mit Schneegirlanden auf die Hoch. Gemutigt von Kleiningen mit Sorgen, war unser neuem freien Tag. Gemutigt von Kleiningen mit Sorgen, war unser neuem freien Tag.
Zygelboim was elected to the Warsaw City Council in 1927. During the first months of the Nazi occupation in Poland, he was a key figure in the underground resistance movement in Warsaw. He was sent to Europe and North America to raise awareness of what was happening to the Jews of Poland. However, his audience was incredulous or indifferent. Even as the Nazis were liquidating the Warsaw Ghetto, his pleas fell on deaf ears. 2023 is the 80th anniversary of his death and his final testament on behalf of our people. Ich kann nicht bleiben still. Ich kann nicht leben, wenn die Rechtler von jüdischen Volk in Polen, demens Vorsteher ich bin, werden umgebracht. Meine Chaverim in Varshever Ghetto seien umgekommen mit Gewehr in Hand in dem letzten heroischen Gerangel. Ich gehöre zu sie und sehr Massenquoren. Mit mein Tod will ich ausdrücken dem stärksten Protest gegen der Passivkeit, mit welcher die Welt guckt sich zu und erlässt die Ausrottung vom jüdischen Volk. Mein Leben gehört zum jüdischen Volk in Polen und dafür gebe ich es ihm weg.
When was it sealed? When was it decreed? Your great, your wonderful, deathless deed? Did it come to you like a child in your dream? Or did a dark messenger bring you the tale in your London exile? Did the messenger come to your door and knock? A woman heavily shrouded in black? I come for the Warsaw Ghetto where the earth is on fire, her clothes and rags a tattered shroud, and her lips red with blood. Then you knocked at doors and found hearts that were closed. You tried to rouse them, but they wouldn't be roused. What people are those who refused to listen when children were gassed and flung on the mound and no one raised a hand? You carry round stacks of papers to show. You may be right, they said, but how can we know? We want to believe you, but these are not facts, and we are bound by conventions and acts. You brought out a list of the dead. How can you prove they are dead, they say. So to convince them, you added your name to the list. You always gave proofs, like a realist. One May night, when the orchards ripened in the land, and spring walked around with stars hand in hand, one window on a London street showed a light. That was you sitting down alone to write. You wrote your last letters and your last testament for the dawn to read before the night was spent. Then a shot rang out, a single shot to wipe out the shame of which you wrote. You died to make the world listen to the cry from the Warsaw Ghetto across the sky.
Unter deine weiße Stirn streckt zu mir deine weiße Hand. Meine Wörter seinen Tränen willen ruhen in dein Hand. Säst Trunk und säher Finkel in mein kellerdicken Blick. Ich hab gar nicht kein Winkel, sei zu schenken dir zurück. Und ich hab gar nicht kein Winkel, sei zu schenken dir zurück.
in mein Verweg. Weil es wohnt in mir a Feier und ich feier meine Tag. Noch in Keller nun Lecher weint die märterische Ruhe. Läuf ich hecher über Dächer und ich such, wo bist du wo? Läuf ich hecher über Dächer und ich such, wo bist du wo? Nehmen Jungen mich beschwune, Trepp und Häufen mit Gebäu. Häng ich an geplatzte Strune und ich sing zu dir so. Unter deine weiße Stirn schreckt zu mir dein weiße Hand. Meine Wörter, seinen Tränen, will ruhen in dein Hand. Meine Wörter, seinen Tränen, will ruhen in dein Hand.
It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Rivka Augenfeld. Rivka came to Canada in 1948 with her parents, Liba Maharshak and David Augenfeld, as stateless displaced persons. She grew up in the Yiddish atmosphere of the Workmen's Circle, the Jewish Labor Bund, and the Montreal Jewish Public Library. For many years, Rivka was a consultant and trainer in the fields of immigration and refugee policy, programs and procedures, resettlement and integration, and intercultural relations. In 2015, to mark the 40th anniversary of the Quebec Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Rivka was one of 40 people honored for their work as activists in the field of human rights. Rivka has also been active in various organizations in the Jewish community. She was a member of the board of directors of the Canadian Jewish Congress, then the Quebec Jewish Congress, until 2011. She was a vice president of the Jewish Public Library Board of Directors until her tenure ended in 2016, and continues to be the chair of its Yiddish Programming Committee. Rivka has collaborated in the translation of Yiddish poetry and prose into English and French. In recent years, she has been the translator and Yiddish coach for a number of Yiddish music and other entertainment initiatives. She has been an active participant in Yiddish cultural programs since childhood.
Teure Chaverim, Chavertes und Freund, dear friends, my warm greetings to all of the people near and far attending this event today. I was very moved and honored to be invited to be your speaker for this year's commemoration of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, an annual event that goes back to the end of World War II. Ever since I was a child, I have participated in these solemn moments. I recited Yiddish poems written by great poets, at first picked by my elders, and then by a group of my peers. We, the second generation, as we were named, became involved in the organization of the programs presented by the Arbeiter Ring and the Bund. But this is the first time in all these years that I've been asked to be the speaker and to have the responsibility of finding the appropriate thoughts and words for this moment. It feels like the moment to look back and try to understand and honor the survivors who came to Canada in various states of shock, suffering, and trauma, but also with an astonishing capacity to keep standing, to continue, to build, to raise new families and build new lives in the hope that the world could still, despite every unspeakable thing that had happened, could still become a better place. That justice, equality, and respect could be hoped for and expected to somehow prevail. But first, I must pay tribute to the wonderful, unique Fanya Feiner, who passed away in Toronto on August 27, 2025, at the age of 100. She was an inspiration, an example of how to be a person of warmth, humor, and great empathy for others. There are a few other survivors still alive, of course, and may they go on for as long as possible. But Fanya is the last from the circle that I grew up in. Kovid ihr Ondenk. May her memory be honored. I hope this can also be a moment to reflect on what their experience teaches us about how to react to events today, how to react to policies and practices that still result in suffering, unfair treatment, and exclusion. It is hard to remember now that during the 1950s, 1960s, and even into the 1970s, the word Holocaust was not heard that much. I can only speak for Montreal, but during those years, there was no annual community-wide Holocaust commemoration. But that does not mean there was no memory and no remembering. On the contrary. I grew up with several annual events, either those organized by the various Landsmannschaften, meaning people coming from different cities and provinces, or by different political and social groups. In Yiddish, they spoke of the Churban, the destruction. These Jews came from Vilna, from Warsaw, Lodz, Kovne, Krakow. In Toronto, there was a big group from Pietrzakov and other cities and towns, all gathering to remember and mourn, each group on a date that was meaningful to them. And in my parents' circle, the most important was April 19th, organized by the Bund, the Workmen Circle, the Jewish Labor Committee, and others, and marking the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, an event that galvanized, inspired, and evoked great pride. There were two big themes, not the only ones, but two big ones. One was, wo ist gewesen die Welt? Where was the world when all this horror was happening? Why was there not more done to stop it? And then also a deep anger at the accusation that was sometimes heard, why did you go like sheep to the slaughter? A question even implied by other Jews, those who were already in the Americas before the war. And the result was that survivors often felt isolated and misunderstood. No wonder that it took a long time to feel welcomed in the larger community. For some, it never really happened. It wasn't until much later, when I was already an adult, that I slowly learned that for far too many survivors, there was not even the comfort of the Landsmannschaft or other organizations. Some people never spoke of their past. They didn't tell their children anything. Too many of my peers grew up with no stories, a big void which they had to fill in many different ways. Therefore, I know that I can't claim to know their story, how their lives were shaped, and what were the effects of not knowing. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was a source of enormous pride and validation. The fact that these young people, formed and educated in various youth groups, were able to find common ground despite important political differences and create a strong clandestine organization, this is remarkable. This was a united front of members who had previously stressed their differences, but they were each part of a group, educated and trained and disciplined. When they came together, they were able to concentrate on what they needed to do together, and it was only possible together. Last year, you also heard from Sam Kassow about another remarkable organization in Warsaw, the one that meticulously gathered, saved, and hid as many artifacts as they could of their rich social, cultural, political, and community culture. This was also tremendous ingenuity and bravery, spiritual resistance, and it has taken a long time for it to be recognized and understood. Another ghetto where armed resistance was organized was in Vilna, the city where my mother Liba grew up and was educated in a unique Yiddish secular school system. She was also a faithful member of the SCIF, the youth movement of the Bund. When the war broke out, she was 16 and still a schoolgirl. For various reasons, my father David, a Warsaw native, ended up in Vilna with a number of his chaverim, with his colleagues. Thanks to his membership in the Bund, he was able to find people he could connect with and trust. By different paths, David and Liba were able to join the partisans, to vow to resist and not to give up without a fight. Their initial intention was to fight in the ghetto to combat the Nazis and die, if that was the only alternative. But it was not to be, Their story led them into the forest, a forest which is now in Belarus, where they spent a year with a partisan group. For those of you who would like to learn more, there is an excellent film made by Josh Waletsky in 1986, The Partisans of Vilna, which tells their story in revealing, honest detail. It's a remarkable film, and I highly recommend it. In 1953, the Vilna writer, poet, musician, and partisan Shmelke Kaczerginsky, many of his songs became folk songs. He came to Montreal and spoke at one of the first memorials for the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. A very emotional presentation. He begins by quoting a famous French writer, he never says who it is, who said, "True human history is written only in blood." Then he, Shmelke, adds, "Therefore, Jewish history is the truest and the most accurate." He goes on to address some of the unfair accusations I mentioned earlier. And he is eloquent about the inspiration that the news of the Warsaw Uprising provided for the partisans in Vilna. It made them more determined than ever to fight and never give up. At the end of this talk, he tells the dramatic story of the poet Hirschglick and how he came to write the partisan hymn, a hymn we sing annually to this day and hopefully for many, many years to come. This particular talk can also be heard among the recordings that are held at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts. After the war, my parents and many others like them left Poland as quickly as possible and ended up in displaced persons camps known as DP camps, some in Germany, our own family in Austria. There began the very difficult job of finding a country that would take them in. Again, affiliations and prior group friendships played an essential role. Whom to trust, how to organize, what to do to make it possible to leave Europe, especially since they were really afraid that because of the post-war tensions, another war might break out. Again, an excellent groundbreaking book about that period and Canada's shameful role before, during, and even after the war is None is Too Many by the historians Irving Abella and Harold Troper. It came out in 1983, and only then did the real story become known to all. People who themselves had lived through that whole period finally understood what had happened to them and why. It was only many years later that I understood much of the significance of all the stories I heard from my parents, our family, and their colleagues and friends. The essential role of affiliation, of belonging to a group or an organization larger than just one's immediate family. It could be a big social organization, a political party, a religious group, people from one's hometown, anything that gave you a wider circle, people who knew you, whom you could trust and who could trust you, people who could vouch for you, attest to your identity, to your background, your education, your occupation. Some people had absolutely no documents. It all had to be recreated and made real enough and credible enough to satisfy the various government officials from different countries. In the early 1970s, quite by chance, I began working at JIAS, Jewish Immigrant Aid Services of Canada. The director, the man who would become my mentor and inspiration, was Dr. Joseph Cage. He was a pioneer in recognizing that immigrants and refugees needed specialized services, not just those offered by the then traditional Jewish social services. He himself had come to Canada as a teenager, well before the war, but his personality and training allowed him to recognize these special needs and how important they were. And then, when he stood at the foot of the boat that brought the first refugees from Europe, he was forever affected by the sight of the Jewish orphans who arrived with tattooed numbers on their arms. I quickly learned that our JIAS approach to new immigrants was cutting edge, and bit by bit over the years, I realized that in dealing with refugees who had suffered and new immigrants generally, I was able to apply the experiences, both positive and negative, and the knowledge of my parents and their circle to my dealings with these newcomers. Of course, I made mistakes, but I always had a little voice, perhaps more than one, in the back of my head. As just one little example, the fact that my father, a high-functioning man by day, had nightmares for over 20 years, nightmares directly related to his experiences during the war. This was a constant reminder of the sensitivity needed when dealing with refugees and displaced persons. Dr. Cage was also a pioneer in reaching out and connecting with colleagues from other faith groups and ethnocultural communities. He joined or helped create a number of widely based coalitions. The most important and long-lasting of these was, in 1978, the Canadian Council for Refugees, the CCR. From the start, I was very fortunate to be able to attend these meetings and quickly learned that we were developing and nurturing allies in new places, and these allies were learning about us as well. Together, we accomplished things that wouldn't have been possible if each had taken their own path. In 1979, in response to the arrival of the Southeast Asian boat people, JIOS was also an active member in the creation of a Montreal-wide and then eventually a Quebec-wide coalition of organizations working for refugees. This meant not only receiving newcomers once they arrived, but being involved more and more in the policy discussions that determined what Canada's and Quebec's, in our case, what our response should be and would be. We quickly learned a lot about how these decisions are made, what factors play a role, what leads to generosity, and what, on the other hand, can lead to restrictive and even punitive measures. We saw how generosity can be encouraged, but also how sometimes one little incident and the accompanying negative publicity can lead to long-lasting restrictions. Of course, the world is not what it was in the 1940s, but we cannot forget some of the important lessons of those years. The realities of finding oneself a potential victim in the middle of an overwhelming conflict, a revolution, or a war. What a person has to do, what a person may do to survive. Let me give you an example of the consequences of forgetting history. Quite a few years ago, I was sitting at a table with a number of government officials discussing new restrictions that they were thinking of imposing on the eligibility of people who would be allowed to make a refugee claim to Canada, whether overseas or within Canada. One of my colleagues, who was not Jewish, was French and had members of her family who had been in the resistance during the war. The bureaucrats were talking about a category called irregular combatants, as people who would be barred from coming to Canada, or if they were already here, would not be allowed to stay. What was an irregular combatant? Anyone not a member of an official army. Suddenly, we got it. With a shiver, all the partisans, all the heroes and heroines of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, all the members of the resistance in France and other countries, out. They would be out. They would not have been eligible. I trust that you can imagine our reaction, our shock and outrage. The officials were surprised at our reaction, tried all kinds of rational explanations, but we really couldn't believe it had come to this. One other example of how we need to be vigilant, also from a number of years ago. Many of you will remember that in 2009 and 2010, 2 boats with Sri Lankan Tamil refugees arrived in Vancouver. The result was a very punitive piece of legislation, C-49. It was tabled in October 2010. A very few short months later, in January of 2011, the then Minister of Immigration, Jason Kenney, came to Halifax to apologize for the treatment of the St. Louis, the boat full of Jews that arrived in 1939, but was never allowed to land by the Canadian authorities. The passengers were forced to return to Europe. That day, in January 2011, the minister said, and I quote, "If Canada had taken a stand in 1939 and opened its doors to people on the MS St. Louis, probably 620 of them would have passed through these halls at Pier 21 in Halifax, seeking Canada's promise of peace and prosperity." What the minister failed to mention was what would have happened if his new legislation had been in force at that time. After some pretty bad treatment, many of the St. Louis passengers would have been forced to return as well. And even those accepted as refugees would have had to wait 5 years to bring their families. The wait would have taken them to 1945. What am I trying to say here? Our job is never over. We can never stop paying attention to how our country treats refugees and asylum seekers. We have to ask questions, look behind the headlines, wonder what important information we are not getting. Wo ist gewesen die Welt? Where was the world? Jews were abandoned before and during World War II. And right after the war, their treatment was not so good either. So now, despite all odds, despite the many difficulties we face, we must remember that together we can do good. Together we can really make a difference. Collectively and individually, to call on governments to do the right thing, to keep our doors open for people suffering and abandoned in this hostile world. We are the world. We must be the world. An essential part of this world is now Hayas, the Jewish agency I so admire that helps refugees from all over the world and is now over 120 years old. They say, we used to help refugees because they were Jewish, and now we help refugees because we are Jewish. Hayas helped so many Jews over the years. I'm sure in almost every Jewish refugee family, there are stories of Hayas's help, their invaluable assistance in getting to safety and a new life. Hayas helped all the survivors and cannot be forgotten. Hayas is a beautiful example of a world citizen. They continue despite all odds, despite all challenges, and right now they are many. They are the world, and I hope they can inspire you all to be the world as well. To end, I want to go back to the survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and all the other survivors of the Home, whether they were in the ghettos, the concentration camps, in hiding, found refuge in the Soviet Union, or elsewhere. What struck me early on were the many pictures from right after the war, whether in the DP camps or elsewhere. People were dressed. They found suits, dresses, clothes that gave them back their human dignity. Perhaps they went without food for a day or two, but they had to be properly dressed. They needed to be in charge of their lives, and sometimes it started with one's outward appearance. It wasn't vanity, it was reclaiming one's pride, one's control over one's life and future. 3 pictures capture this feeling for me in different ways. First, Vanya Feiner, who I mentioned earlier. Vanya dressed in a Bund uniform and marching in the May Day parade in Poland, very soon after her liberation from Auschwitz. The second is a group of passengers getting off the boat in New York in 1946 or 1947. They include Vladka Mead and her husband Binyamin, Vladka, who is known to many as one of the very important resistance fighters during the war. And in this picture as well are my parents' dear friends and fellow partisans, Chayele and Shimke Palevsky. If you didn't know who they were, you might well think that this group was returning from a pleasure cruise. And the last, on a very personal note, in the summer of 1946, a picture of 2 young women, my mother and her friend, Saul Lesheskin, wearing pretty flowered dresses and pregnant with their soon-to-be-born daughters, Chanele and Rivka. And last, the words of Chayele Palevsky, spoken in 2019, near the end of her life, in an interview that she gave to Judy Battalion, the author of the much-acclaimed book, The Light of Days. Chayele said, "We must never let this happen again. Hate is our fiercest enemy. Be peaceful, be loving, and work to create a world of happiness." A großen Dank. Thank you.
Neshames von Yiddishist, behalten in die Parmeten von Ewigkeit. Werden sie aufstehen von Toll, von Teut, wird auf sie ablost von die Sehung von Leben. Nur du, mein Gott, weißt, wie stark sie seinen gewähren, weil du hast sie gebeugt mit ein verstandiger Gwure. Nur du, mein Gott, hast gewusst, wie schwach sie seinen gewähren, eder sie seinen weg mit dem Räuch. Du hast nicht geschützt die jüdische Stadt, sie nicht verfestigt, seinen See wie die heilige Oysgeshternt abgesprungen von Leben. Jetzt hängen Possele Nemmen auf Beistillen von Wüste wegen, alle Grenzen von dein Welt seinen Tome. Kommen die Neshames von jüdischer Stadt weinen von Kisse Hakobet. Gott, Baruch Hu, sehr wie gründlich Chorb wir seinen. Du hast uns erschaffen in dein Gestalt, jetzt ist dein Welt ein Stück Guf, Adomen. Die Getzflecker klingen jetzt die Namen von Städt. Warsaw, Wilna, Chelm, Lublin. In Tag, wenn ich will bauen mein Haus, euch vergessen will ich in die jüdische Stadt, so verstummt werden mein Zung und vertreuerigt werden die Hand, was beut Gottes Haus auf dem Berg, auf ein Fundament von so viel vergessen ist. Verworret der Schlaf, der nicht Rimmler und nicht Schlafer. Lass sich vorlehnen die gestorbenen Namen von die heilige jüdische Stadt. Schmeckt der Semmelmehl von seiner Jüdischkeit. Es geht euch Rachmim, was hat sich abgetan von der ganzen Welt. Es weinen tausender Kinderschire.
Guten Morgen, liebe Menschen. Warft unser Stickerle Bräut. Der Fahr wird Gott euch Menschen. Nicht wissen wird ihr von kein Neut. Gehatet Mame. Und schönige Schwester lacht rein. Und schönige Schwester lacht rein. Weg mit den Räuch und Flammen, geblieben bin ich jetzt allein. Ich dreh die Karte Rinke und spiel Heimvereich mit dem Rasch und spiel Heimvereich mit dem Rasch, weil morgen kommt sein wird werden von unser Bagage. Der Hunger ist ein Zorre, mit heute versät in der Ruck, mit heute versät in der Ruck, bei jedem Rachmonim, es wird sich noch Lamentations. Ein Kohl, die Luft sich schmetter, und morgen wie spät in der Nacht, und morgen wie spät in der Nacht, verschotten so sein das Ghetto, und die, was haben es euch getracht. Gekeulet wie Schof, genug uns gekeulet wie Schof. Jeden nimmt die Speiers und Kumpler mir machen das Sof. Dreht die Karte Rinke, verspiel unsere Leiden und Neut. Verspiel unsere Leiden und Leid, weil heute, weil jeder zu Geld verblieben, ist besser in
Let us remember our brothers and sisters, their cities and villages, the town's noisy streets, the lonely village inn, the distinguished old man, a young girl with her braids, an infant, all of the Jewish communities with their thousands of families, a whole Jewish existence sentenced to death on the European continent by the Nazi executioner, the sudden outcry of a man who died, the woman who cradled her baby till her arms dropped, the infant seeking its mother's breast when it was cold and blue, the feet, those feet trying to escape but could not, fists full of steel, the steel becoming weapons of despair, visions, and rebellion. Those heroes of the heart, open-eyed, daring, gave their lives but could not gain a victory. Let us remember the day at noontime when the sun gazed down on the slaughter from high in the silent sky. Let us remember the pile of ashes under the blossoming gardens and the dead who stare at us. They look from all sides, calling out for revenge. And let us, with our lives, bear witness and be their memorial.
Ich zind mein Treuer wie yortsayt Lichter, noch eich martierel heilige Gesichter, yortsayt Licht noch mein Heim. Wie die Kedoshim, ihr seid gestorben. Mit eich wird leuchten unser Morgen, ihr wird keinmal nicht vergehen. Wie der Phönix von die Stäuben, von Asch sich wieder aufgehäuben, so wird ihr aufgehen. Von die Oyfns, von die Flammen, von dritten Hoben aufgestanden, mein Volk wird nicht vergehen. Du, mein Kind, du wirst mich erben. Ein Volk darf leben und nicht sterben. Ich schreibe für dir das Lied. Du sollst dem vor dem weiter spinnen. Mein Volk soll wachsen und soll grünen. Gedenk, du bist der Jid. Du, mein Kind, von Stamm a Zweigel. Vor mein Dor du sollst, nicht schweigen. Gedenk die Nazi-Schlang. Unser Volk wird sich zerzweigen, mit neuer Gewürge widersteigen in sein Heldengang.
Es zieht sich durch endlose Deures und zieht, der gewaltige Völkergeschläg. Es zittert das Schlachtfeld mir unter die Tritt, ich gehe mir als weiter mein Weg. Durch Samt und durch Dayne, durch Stein und durch Bein, ich gehe und ich will noch ausgehen. Ich hab mit den Sotten Hamaschkes allein geschlossen an ewigen Bund. Das Feuer, es soll mich nicht brennen. Das Wasser, es soll mich nicht schlingen. Der Spieß soll mich stechen nicht kennen. Die Keul soll zurück von mir springen. Ich fühl, ich bin stärker von allen Jesuren, von menschlicher Bösheit und Streit, und stärker von Wasser, von Feuer, von Sturm, und stärker a vielu von Zeit. Es seien vor mir durch die tausender Jahren die Maluches die Gräste gegangen verloren, die Völker die stärkste vertilgt geworden, und Weltstädte ackert in Salz. Und riesige Berg seinen lang schon zerschotten, und ewige Wälder zerfeult und zertrotten, und mächtige Felsen zerweicht und zerknotten. Ich leb und gedeih noch aus. Ich leb und ich will noch ausleben durch tausende Jahren von Streit. Ich will noch ausleben und kämpfen und streben, und Temp ist der Zorn von der Zeit.
Es wird auch heute unser Volk sein.